Welcome to Baby Boomer Tales. My name is Jim. Back in May of 2020, I released a podcast titled Producing a Podcast. At the time when I released it, I thought I'd share my journey, how I became a podcaster, and all that was involved in the process of figuring out what kind of microphone and editing program and how to put it out where people can find it, how to make a website so I could help promote the podcast and all of that stuff. My podcast has evolved since my first one in February of 2019. This is our 149th episode. We release one every Wednesday. Meeting that Wednesday deadline is both a grind at times and a challenge, but once I finish recording and editing and finally publishing it, there's a sense of accomplishment that really kind of settles me and lets me know that I can do this. I go through this almost every time, unless for some reason I have a list of ones that I'm excited to do, to write out the outline, and to sit down and record it, and then to do the dreaded first edit. That sucker can take me several hours to do the first edit, between writing down where I messed something up, trying to get the time down between 15 and 20 minutes, taking out all the seconds and seconds of dead air space, wondering why I said this, and questioning myself, how can I fix that? It takes a long time on that first edit. But once the first edit is over, everything seems to go much quicker, and I'm starting to see a picture of what the podcast really is going to look like, and I may get some more ideas that I can interject here and there during the course of the broadcast. And all of a sudden, my apprehension and my questioning and my being down about it has been overcome, and I'm actually excited as it comes together. Now, I try to have 4 or 5 of them recorded and published and scheduled to go out at a certain time. I never record, say, the Christmas one and publish it before I do the Thanksgiving one. I do them in order every time. And so right now, even though this episode is released on December 1st, it's actually November 13th that I'm recording it. I'm still a little bit behind, and that'll happen to me during the summer season because I may be busy working outside or doing this or going there. But in the winter, I'm confined mostly to home, and I have a lot of time to work on this. I've gotten better with my craft, I feel. And it takes less time from beginning to end to create a podcast than it used to. But sometimes, if something goes wrong, it can take much longer. One prime example is that podcast from May of 2020, the first producing a podcast episode. I got a little too eager or trying to do it too fine or something. I kept adjusting the sound, and all of a sudden, for some reason, I started getting echoes that I couldn't take out. I started getting where all of a sudden my voice was louder and then real soft, and I couldn't repair it. I had repaired it so many times, I think the program glitched a little. And so I had to go back through and do a manual edit, sentence by sentence, word by word. And that particular podcast took longer than the average 8 hours to do. Anymore, I can sometimes get a podcast from writing down the outline to publishing it. Sometimes I can get one done in 4 to 5 hours. I listen to them at least a half a dozen times during the editing process. So if you have 15 minutes a podcast, that's an hour and a half just listening to it, making sure I didn't say anything wrong or any of that. Prime example of that is last podcast about things I miss. When I was explaining about my dad setting up the projector to show home movies, I explained how he ran the tape up in through the machine and onto another reel to wind it up. And I should have said ran the film. I knew it when I did it, or the first edit anyway, when I heard it, and I chose to leave that in. There's reasons I choose to leave some stuff in, some mistakes in the way I say a word or put a sentence together or whatever. As long as I can understand it and don't mumble it, a lot of times I'll leave that in, my folksy, friendly way about me. At least the folksy, friendly way I'd like to be. So I've learned through editing not to do too much. Less is better. But 2 years ago, I really thought more was better. The more I did it, the better it would get. And that's not always the case. Try to keep your voice like it is, how you're speaking into your microphone. Sometimes I hear myself and I feel like I'm way too mellow on this. Other times I'll listen to one and I sound way too excited. And I'm almost barking my words out. But all that really has something to do with the way your day's going when you're recording. I try to keep that to a minimum as far as fluctuations. But once you record a podcast, or at least once I record it, unless something's botched so terribly and you make mistakes or you say many things that could offend or hurt or just absolutely wrong to say in the first place, I don't want to go back and re-record, even though I have a couple times. Like I said, after I'm all done editing it and think I'm ready to publish it, I always sleep on it. I may wake up in the middle of the night and realize that I said something that I shouldn't have, or I didn't say something I wish I would have. So sleeping on it at night keeps you from rushing something through, and sometimes can actually rescue that whole project. Types of podcasts. I have several types of podcasts. My first one, and it is my meat and potatoes, or should I say meat, potatoes, and gravy. It's the regular tale, a story of something I did somewhere during my life. These are as true as I can remember, even though later, like 6 months later, if I happen to listen to it, and I remember it a little differently then. When I'm recording it and telling it, it is as actual, as factual, and as correct as I can possibly be at the time. Number 2 is lists. I have many lists, and they really help me with filling in, trying to get up to my 15 minutes, or making a whole episode out of a certain list. Some of my lists are the top 10 55 years ago. That's the top 10 pop songs 55 years ago that week. And I try to do that monthly, but I probably do that 10 times a year. I know I skip a month once in a while. Decades, I go through, for an example, the 60s or the 70s. In 2022, I plan on doing the decade of the 50s. I also did one called Baby Boom, which started on VJ Day, Victory over Japan, when World War II finally came to an end, right up to 1950. That's when the baby boom actually really started, and then it exploded. TV shows. I'll go through a decade of TV shows, usually tell the top shows of that year. Year-end lists. I can go through all different kinds of things, like favorite coaches, favorite players, favorite movies, etc. There's one that I do every year called my 29 all-time favorite music songs. I thought that was going to be a one-time deal 3 years ago, and it turned out that I started hearing songs and thinking, I wish that would have been on that list. So I did a volume 2, and of course I went through the same emotions again as time went on, and so I did a volume 3. Did I do a volume 3? Yes, I did a volume 3, so in 2022 we will do a volume 4. What I'm going to try to do on this one is all the artists that I have skipped over. I'm going to try to find some songs that I feel worthy of those lists. I do believe I could probably do one of these every year. Music's an amazing thing that really depends on the time and the experience of that time for your life you may hold very dear. Most definitely more than 29 songs, that's a fact. Lists should be always historically or statistically correct. The third type of podcast I do, Kate's General Store. It is patterned after a radio show, and it's strictly fiction. My fourth type of podcast, and this is something new I've come across in the last few months, Forky and Earl. My good friend growing up, Wayne, my little nickname for him was Forky. His nickname for me was Earl. You'll see Earl all through our podcast, but Forky and Earl. This is a true tale with the author's permission, my permission, to adjust or enhance the story. Kind of like them doing a movie from a book based on a true story, that kind of stuff. The fifth type of podcast I do is Boomer Tall Tales, an exaggerated and manipulated series of stories based on fact. This for me is the hardest type to figure out and to do. I've done 3 of them. I don't know when the 4th one will ever be. Paul Bunyan, Pecos Bill, that kind of stuff really takes a lot of thought and imagination. Both sometimes I wonder if I have enough of. The 6th type, and this usually happens towards the first of the episode, I do a monologue. It usually includes a little bit about my life now and then. Also, even though we don't do current events on our podcast, I may refer to something very, very lightly without any opinions whatsoever. And then I like to throw in a joke or two also. That's my monologue. And those are what our structure is there, for right or wrong, whatever. I've been encouraged to do factual tales, but I try to do as close to facts as I can during my tales without being a history teacher or trying to make you feel like you need to go to the World Book Encyclopedia or Google and look it up. But you're always free to. You bet your bottom dollar. Also, I've been encouraged to do a different podcast, and I could do that, not doing away with Baby Boomer Tales at all, but doing a second podcast. My podcast host, Podbean, will let me do 2 different podcasts on the plan that I have subscribed to with them. They're very good when something goes wrong, like every time the time changes from daylight savings time to standard time or vice versa. I have things go wrong with my RSS feed at some of the places. YouTube's a perfect example. For some reason, YouTube does not like if the time changes. And I have to write my podcast provider and have them fix that. I'll go around on Twitter and manually put one in, or Tumblr, put one in there. Facebook, sometimes it misses. And that's not good if I decide to sleep in that day. It's okay if I get up early. Podcast is supposed to publish and get thrown out there 3 o'clock Central Daylight Time in the morning every Wednesday. How I come up with a podcast is really a very complicated thing for me. The best I can tell you is whenever I get an idea, if I have it together at all that day, I'll write it down on my list or put it into my notes on my phone to transfer to my list. My list is an ever-evolving thing. Sometimes I'll look at that idea and have no idea what I was thinking. Other times there may be just one word and I take off with an idea on it. But so often during the last 3 years, I've thought of something like, for an example, while I'm in the shower, tripping out, or when I'm sleeping, I'm kind of in that whirl between sleep and consciousness. And I think of something, I'm either too busy being wet or fading out so fast I can't bring myself to write that stuff down. And by the time I remember to put it down, I've forgotten what it was. Very frustrating. You know you had something. You know it sounded good at the time. You know that maybe I could do something with that. And it's gone. I hope it comes back. I always hope it comes back. I always need an idea. I know I did more things growing up and in my young life that I haven't shared. And by golly, I want to share it. Mainly because I want to share it with my grandchildren. When you pass from this life, it takes less than a generation to be forgotten to time. What a sad state of affairs, and yet that's the way it's meant to be. So I would still do that because it gives me a sense of purpose and accomplishment. And like I said, I'm sharing my life. So maybe somebody somewhere will smile or be helped by it, or they can relate, or if they're down, maybe it'll pick them up just a little. Maybe help them as they find their way in life. It's not easy, this thing called life. It's not easy at all. But we all have to help each other any way we can. We all have different gifts and abilities, and if we choose to use them or not, well, that's our choice. I hope you find it inside of you to share your strengths with somebody else. Always be kind. It's the high road. I'll be back next Wednesday. Peace out.